In the spring of 1981, a middle-aged scientist stood at the edge of a flooded rice paddy in the mountains of central China, raised a camera to his eye, and pressed the shutter until the film ran out. His name was Liu Yinzeng. The valley sat in Yangxian, a poor farming county pressed against the southern foot of the Qinling Range in Shaanxi province. In front of him, stepping through shallow water on long legs, were a few gray and white birds with red faces and long, down-curved black bills. He had spent 3 years looking for those birds. He had crossed roughly 50,000 kilometers of China, 9 provinces, carrying a photograph and asking villagers if they had ever seen anything like it. And he had walked into that valley not expecting to find them. He had come, by his own account, to finish the job of confirming they were gone. Liu later said that every press of the shutter sounded like thunder to him, and that his 36 exposure roll was used up before he could think. There were 7 birds in that valley, 2 adult pairs and 3 young. As far as anyone on Earth knew at that moment, those 7 were the entire species. Every crested ibis left alive. I'm Sam Harris, and this is the real story of one of the strangest second chances in the recorded history of life on this planet. It's a story most people have never heard, even though it ranks among the closest calls any animal has ever survived. And it carries a question I want you to hold on to, because the answer is not the one you would guess. Here's the question. The crested ibis had once lived across an enormous stretch of the world: China, the Korean Peninsula, Japan, the Russian Far East. By 1981, it had been scrubbed out of nearly all of it, gone from the big rivers, gone from the rich lowlands, gone from most of the places where people had money and machines and modern farms. And yet 7 of them were still alive in one particular spot. Not a remote, untouched wilderness, not a place humans had never reached. They were living in a small, busy farming valley, nesting in trees beside people's houses, feeding in fields that farmers worked every single day. The last survivors of a vanishing wild bird had made their final stand in the middle of human territory. Why there? Why those 7, in that valley, surrounded by people, when the bird had failed everywhere humans were richer and the land was wider? Keep that in mind. We'll come back to it, and when we do, it changes how you see the whole rescue. First, the bird itself, because you need to picture what was nearly lost. The crested ibis carries the scientific name Nipponia Nippon. It stands about 70 to 80 centimeters tall, with a wingspan that can reach 1.5 meters, a bill 15 to 18 centimeters long, and bare red skin on its face and legs. A male weighs around 2 kilograms. In flight, the underside of its wings glows a soft pink. People in the region have long called it the Oriental gem. It belongs to an old lineage, one believed to have existed for more than 60 million years, which places it among the oldest bird species still alive. For most of human history, it was simply a common bird of the East Asian countryside, the kind of thing a farmer would see every day and never think about. And across the region, it was regarded as a lucky bird, a sign of good fortune over the fields. There are around 24 ibis species in the world, and this one had quietly become one of the rarest of them all. Hold those 2 facts next to each other for a second. A creature that had lasted through more than 60 million years, through ice ages, and the rise and fall of whole landscapes, came within 7 individuals of ending inside a single human lifetime. Then, in a matter of decades, it almost ceased to exist. The collapse came in the 20th century, and the causes were ordinary. As farming modernized across the region, chemical pesticides and fertilizers spread through the paddies and wetlands where the ibis fed. Those chemicals stripped the shallow water of the small fish, the loaches, the frogs, and insects the birds lived on. Old forests were cut for timber and fuel, and with them went the tall trees the ibis needed for nesting. In some places, people hunted the birds, partly for those pink feathers. None of this was aimed at the crested ibis. It was simply the side effect of land being used harder and more efficiently. The bird had nowhere to stand, and it fell away country by country until it seemed to be finished. You can measure how close the end came by looking at Japan, where the species was so woven into the landscape that its name lives inside the scientific one. Crested ibises had once been a familiar sight there, common enough that a single farmer near one village could count more than 24 feeding in his paddies within living memory. By the 1930s, they were already in steep decline. Japan gave the bird the protected status of a natural monument and later raised it to special natural monument, the highest tier of protection the country grants. It was not enough. The Second World War tore through the forests where the birds sheltered as woodland was felled for fuel. And here is a detail worth pausing on because it explains more than it first appears to. Once the hillsides above the feeding creeks were stripped of their trees, those sheltered streams where the ibises fed through the winter were left exposed, and in the cold months, they filled with snow. The birds lost the one place that had kept them fed when everything else froze. Strip the right trees from the right slope, and you do not just take away nests, you take away the winter larder. The flocks dwindled year after year, down to a handful, then to almost none. By the early 1980s, the Japanese authorities had brought the last wild ones into captivity to try to breed them. It did not work. The birds died, one after another, until a single individual was left. A whole nation's population of an ancient species had come down to one bird, with no mate and no future. So picture the moment with the full weight of it. In late June of 1981, news reached Japan's conservation center by way of the Xinhua news agency. 7 wild crested ibises, including young birds, had been found in the mountains of Shaanxi. For the people who had watched their own birds die down to the last one, that report from China was the difference between extinction and survival for the entire species on Earth. That is the situation Liu Yinzeng had walked into. He was a researcher at the Institute of Zoology of the Chinese Academy of Sciences, and in 1978 he was handed one of the bleakest assignments a field biologist can get. Pressed by the international zoology community, the Academy sent him to settle the question of whether the crested ibis still existed in the wild anywhere at all. Liu, then in his 40s, set out to find out. For 3 years, he and his colleagues walked. They covered that enormous distance across the country, going village to village, holding up a picture of the bird, asking, listening, following every thread a local could offer. The method was as simple and as exhausting as it sounds. Time after time, the answer was no. On some occasions, the answer was worse, that someone had shot the last one they ever saw, years before, for its feathers. Each dead end narrowed the map a little further, and each narrowing pointed toward the same grim conclusion. By the end, he had begun to write that conclusion down. He had a paper prepared that would declare the crested ibis extinct in China. Consider what kind of work that is. He had given years of his life, walking the equivalent of more than once around the planet, in order to prove that something was dead. He has said as much himself, that toward the end, the mission had quietly turned into an effort to confirm an absence, and that proving an absence is the harder task, because you have to scout every last inch of ground before you can put your name to the word extinct. There is no comfort in that kind of certainty. It is years of effort spent earning the right to write down a loss. Before he signed it, he asked for one more field visit, to Yangxian, and in that valley, in May of 1981, on the 23rd, and again a week later on the 30th, the paper he had prepared became worthless, because the thing he had come to bury was standing in the water in front of him. The paper he eventually published that year did not announce an ending. It reported a recovery, and he gave it a title to match, On the Return of the Crested Ibis in the Qinling Range. He had set out to write an obituary and ended up writing a birth announcement. So now we arrive at the heart of it. Why Yangxian? Why did 7 crested ibises survive in that one farming county when the species had been wiped out of every grander, wealthier landscape it once owned? The answer runs against the story we usually tell about saving wild animals. We tend to imagine that nature survives where people are absent, that the way to protect a rare creature is to draw a line, push the humans out, and let the wilderness be wild. The crested ibis did not survive that way. It survived because of a particular kind of human farming, and it could not have survived without it. Yangxian was poor, and it was mountainous, and that turned out to be the whole point. The valley had not been modernized. Its farmers still flooded their paddies in the old way and worked them by hand. They could not afford the pesticides and chemical fertilizers that had emptied the water everywhere else, so their fields were still alive with the loaches and small fish and frogs the ibis needs to eat. They had kept the big old trees standing near their villages, the kind the ibis builds its nest in. The shallow, muddy, unsprayed paddy, worked by people but not poisoned by them, is close to a perfect feeding ground for this bird. It wades through the soft mud, probing for food with that long, curved bill, and a flooded rice field maintained the traditional way gives it exactly what it requires, in the warm months and through the cold ones too. Recall what happened in Japan when the wrong trees came down and the winter feeding grounds froze over. Yangxian had not made that mistake, not by design, but by poverty. The trees still stood, the water still ran clean and shallow. The ibis, which could not survive industrial agriculture, had quietly held on inside traditional agriculture. It was living off human farmland. It needed the farmers, and the part of the country too poor to modernize was the only part that still had room for it. Once you understand that, the rescue stops being about fences and starts being about a deal with the people who live there. China grasped this very early. As far back as that first year, Yangxian County issued rules to protect the birds, and by extension, the conditions they depended on. Logging was banned around them. Hunting was banned. The use of pesticides and fertilizers was prohibited in the area, and so was the clearing of land and the use of explosives in the local mines. Because the birds nest near where people live, and a single blast or a felled tree can wreck a breeding season. A small team was posted to watch over the nesting sites. In June of 1981, a temporary protection station went up in one of the villages, staffed by 4 young men led by a man named Liu Yinzeng, and they monitored the birds as they fed, day after day. The early growth of the population, by Liu's account, came down to one thing more than any other. The local villagers were willing to share their land with the birds. But there's a hard edge to that arrangement, and this is where the story has to be honest. Telling a farmer he can't use pesticide or fertilizer is telling him to accept a smaller harvest. These were not wealthy people, and you cannot save a bird by quietly making the poorest farmers in a valley poorer and expect it to hold. The fear was real and local. When ibises later turned up in one village, some of the farmers worried the birds would eat the loaches and small fish in their paddies and cut into what little they had. So the solution had to work for the humans too. Over the years, the conservation authorities, working alongside international bodies including the IUCN and local agricultural businesses, helped build a different kind of economy around the bird. The county developed organic, chemical-free rice, grown in those same ibis-friendly paddies, and sold it at a higher price precisely because of how it was grown. The clean fields that fed the birds produced a premium crop, and the higher price made up for the smaller yield. A local bird-watching figure named Hua Ying pushed, back in 2003, for the government to actively help sell those pollution-free products and to bring in careful tourism, with viewing platforms placed so that birders would not disturb the nests. Yang County's organic rice eventually drew recognition well beyond Shaanxi, taken up as a model of farming that works with a protected species rather than against it. The villagers who had feared the ibis came to understand something that flipped the worry on its head. The birds had chosen their village because the ecosystem there was healthy. The ibis was not a threat to the harvest. Its presence was proof the land was clean. Alongside that work in the fields, scientists pursued the other half of the rescue. The Beijing Zoo had begun trying to establish a captive population in the 1980s, achieving its first artificially hatched chick by 1990. A dedicated rescue and breeding center was built in Yangxian in the early 1990s, and within about 2 years, the team there managed its first successful artificial hatching. From then on, the two halves of the effort reinforced each other. Birds were protected in the wild and bred in captivity, and the captive-raised birds were trained and released to strengthen the wild flocks. Slowly, carefully, against very long odds, the numbers grew. The result of all of it, 4 decades on, is hard to take in when you remember where it started. Those 7 birds, the entire species, in one valley in 1981. The habitat available to the crested ibis in China at that point was less than 5 square kilometers, a patch of ground you could walk across in an afternoon. By the most recent figures, reported by China's Xinhua news agency, citing the Shaanxi Provincial Forestry Bureau, the global population of the crested ibis passed 12,000 by the end of 2025, and the area it lives across had grown to more than 20,000 square kilometers. Yangxian alone holds thousands of them. On the IUCN Red List, the bird was lifted around the turn of the century out of the most severe category and reclassified as endangered, which in the grim accounting of extinction counts as triumphant news. And the help flowed back outward, to the country whose own birds had died down to one. In the 1990s, China gave crested ibises to Japan to rebuild the population there, and the offer carried weight beyond biology. When the Chinese president visited Japan in 1998 and met the emperor, the gift of a pair of the birds was part of how the two countries spoke to each other. The crested ibis became a kind of bridge between them. The Japanese flocks alive today descend from those Chinese ancestors. The valley that held the final 7 became the source that began to restock the world. That work is still going on, and it has become deliberate in a way it never could have been at the start. With the population secure enough in Shaanxi, the breeding centers have started exporting birds to rebuild flocks across China and abroad, sending out hundreds as breeding stock, until the people running the program could say plainly that Yangxian had become the source of breeding stock for the entire world. Crested ibises have been released back onto the lowest plateau in the north, in places like Yan'an and Yulin that were favored habitat long ago, to test whether the species can take the colder climate of its old range. In 2026, a group of birds was sent east to a reserve in Fujian province, marking the first time the species had returned there since it had gone locally extinct. Inside China, the spread has been thorough enough that wild populations of the crested ibis now exist in every one of Shaanxi's cities, not only the one valley where the story began. Getting captive birds ready for that kind of release is itself painstaking work. Birds raised by people cannot simply be let go and expected to survive, so the breeding centers put them through wild training, holding them in large net enclosures where they learn to find food, avoid danger, and behave like wild birds before the door is ever opened. The county where it all started is spoken of now as the hometown of the crested ibis, and it has become something close to a sanctuary for a species that, within living memory, existed only there. The scientists have even begun to loosen the one constraint that defined the whole crisis. The ibis nearly died because it was tied so tightly to clean rice paddies and freshwater wetlands. In an experiment on the coast at Beidaihe in Hebei province, researchers found that captive crested ibises could get a substantial share of their food from coastal organisms rather than from rice fields alone. That mattered far more than it sounds, because it suggested the bird need not depend absolutely on the kind of habitat that had become its trap. It opened the possibility of releasing ibises along the eastern seaboard and farther north, widening the map of places the species could call home. The people running the recovery have set themselves a target of restoring the crested ibis to its full historical range by the middle of the next decade. The bird that had shrunk to a single valley is being carried, by hand and on purpose, back across territory it had vanished from entirely. It would be easy to stop there, on the clean shape of a miracle. I don't think that would be honest, and honesty is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling. So here is what the celebration tends to leave out. Every crested ibis alive today, all 12,000 and more of them, traces back to those 7 birds. 2 pairs and 3 young. That is an extraordinarily narrow gate for an entire species to pass through. It means the genetic variety of the whole population is thin, because there were only ever a few founders to inherit from. Liu Yinzeng himself named inbreeding as the central challenge that remains. He has said that so far the birds seem to be coping with it better than feared, but that scientists genuinely worry about the long-term cost of such low genetic diversity, the kind of hidden weakness that can leave a population fragile in the face of a new disease or a shifting climate. The people running the breeding programs have known this from the beginning, which is part of why they spread the birds across separate locations and move breeding stock between regions, working to widen the gene pool as much as a species built from 7 ancestors can be widened. That foresight goes back a long way. From early in the recovery, Chinese scientists treated the narrowness of the founding stock as a problem to manage rather than ignore, deliberately establishing breeding groups in more than one place so that the whole genetic future of the species would never again rest in a single flock. There is a second risk that comes with success too, which is concentration. For a long time, most of the world's crested ibises lived in and around one county, and a population packed into a single place is exposed to a single bad event, an outbreak or a disaster that could undo decades in a season. Spreading the birds out is not only about genetics, it is about never again letting the whole species sit in one valley. The numbers are real, and the recovery is real. The fragility underneath them is also real, and pretending otherwise would do the bird no favors. A species can be both saved and not yet safe. There's a wider truth pressing up through this story, and it's worth saying plainly, because it cuts against an instinct most of us share. We like to think of conservation as protecting nature from people. Build the reserve, keep the humans out, let the wild be wild. The crested ibis did not survive that way, and it is not recovering that way. It survived because a community of poor farmers happened to work the land gently, and it recovered because people chose to keep working the land that way on purpose, and to build a living around doing so. The bird's fate was braided into how human beings farmed rice. When the farming was industrial, the bird died. When the farming was patient and chemical-free, the bird had somewhere to stand. The thing that nearly destroyed this species and the thing that saved it were the same thing: human agriculture, turned to two different ends. That is an uncomfortable idea for anyone who wants nature and people kept in separate boxes. It is also a hopeful one, because it means the question is rarely whether humans should be present. The question is how. There are people who have given much of their lives to that question. A painter named Yangxian, raised in Russia on stories of the bird, came to the rice paddies of Yangxian and stayed, and has made close to 1,000 paintings of crested ibises in the years since. For her, the recovery is not a statistic. It is the sight of the birds crossing the fields, over and over, in a place where people decided to leave room for them. That is, in the end, what the 12,000 really represent. Not a number generated by nature left alone, but a number produced by a long, deliberate, sometimes costly choice made by ordinary people, year after year, to farm in a way that left the water clean and the old trees standing. There is a reason this story is worth the time it takes to tell properly. Most of what we hear about wild animals runs one direction, toward loss. A species declines, a number shrinks, a habitat disappears, and the report ends there. A British conservationist who has spent years working in China and went back to Yangxian for the 40th anniversary of the discovery put it simply, that we hear so many stories of losing species that it matters to be reminded a species can be pulled back from the edge at all. The crested ibis is one of the few cases clear enough to point to. Not a slowed decline, not a holding pattern. A bird that went from 7 known individuals to more than 12,000, while the people around it changed how they lived in order to make the room. That does not happen often, and when it does, it is worth understanding exactly how. So go back with me to where we began. A valley in Yangxian, May of 1981. A tired scientist who had walked across the country to prove that a bird was gone, standing in the mud with a camera, watching 7 birds that should not have existed. He had carried the conclusion of extinction in his bag, ready to be signed. Instead, he used up his film on the proof that he was wrong, and a species got its second chance because one man asked for a single extra field trip before giving up. The crested ibis is still here. It is still classed as endangered, still leaning on a thin genetic foundation, still dependent on people choosing to leave room for it, and the work of spreading it back across its old range is far from finished. None of that is settled. But the bird that was reduced to 7 now numbers past 12,000, flying over the same kind of paddies, nesting in the same kind of trees beside the same kind of villages, restored a little further across its old map every year, having begun again in a valley that was too poor to kill it, and turned out to be exactly poor enough to save it. The habitat that was once less than 5 square kilometers now runs past 20,000. The 7 birds that one man photographed until his film ran out have become a population that no single bad season could erase. And the people of that valley, the farmers who kept their water clean because they could not afford to do otherwise, and then kept it clean because they chose to, turned out to be the reason any of it was possible. If this story changed how you see what it takes to bring a species back, tell me in the comments, and consider subscribing. The real stories of the natural world are slower, stranger, and more tangled up with our own choices than the headlines ever let on, and there are far more of them waiting than you'd ever guess. I'm Sam Harris. Thanks for watching.